What I'd like to do today is talk to you about the media and the role of the media in young people's lives. American youth spend about 7.5 hours with media each day, mostly with TV and with music. So media consumption is a major part of their lives. It's estimated that youth spend more time consuming media than doing any other activity over the course of a year than sleeping. So sleeping 1, media 2, and then probably school. So in addition to concerns about the time that you spend with media, several people are often concerned about the content, right? You hear a lot of discussion about media violence and its impact on young people, and that is indeed a cause for concern. But one of the other things I've been thinking about is what the media teach us about gender and about what it means to be a woman or a man. The media provide abundant examples of what it means to be a woman or a man in society. Messages, for example, about how women and men look, right? We think sexiest man alive. We think most beautiful woman in the world, right? That provides information about the jobs and activities that women and men do. Think about programs like, Chicago Fire or American Housewife, give you indication about gender and jobs. The media gives information about personality attributes. I think these women are crying and eating ice cream, and there he's shooting with a giant gun. And the media also give information about how women and men behave in relationships. So what is the evidence of media effects on gender socialization? And I didn't check. Can folks hear me okay? Maybe I should. If I lean in, then it'll be weird and I can't do this. What are the evidence of media effects on gender socialization? So last year, I co-authored a report for Common Sense Media, summarizing the current research trying to answer that question. And here's what we know. We know, for example, that messages are often very sort of traditional and stereotypical in the media, not always, but often. For women, there's often a heavy emphasis on their appearance, on women as sexual objects, and limited roles for women, often as nurturant mother or a victim. For men, the messages focus on their being aggressive, fighting, being leaders, heavy emphasis on their finance, their status, and on men as sexual. And in terms of the impact of these messages, findings indicate that higher levels of media exposure are associated with more sexist attitudes and with holding more traditional or stereotypical notions about women and men. So that's kind of what we know in general in the report that we reviewed for the field. But what we don't know is how these dynamics play out for African Americans, because there's little research testing media effects on gender beliefs among Black youth or Black adults. So if we think through what we might expect, for example, that maybe they're more affected by the media than we know, because Black youth consume more media than children of all other ethnic groups. So we talked about media effects on youth, and Black youth are consuming more, perhaps they could be more affected. In terms of numbers, daily TV time for Black youth is 5 hours and 54 minutes, compared with 3 hours and 36 minutes for white youth. And in terms of total media hours, we get about 9+ hours for Black youth compared to 6 hours or so for white youth. So maybe they could be more affected. Thinking it through, we might also say, well, I don't know, maybe they'll be less affected by the media, especially because of the under and misrepresentation of African Americans in mainstream media, right? If they don't see people that look like them or represent images that seem authentic or real, maybe they won't be affected by them. So you could go that way. Or you might also think, well, maybe the effects are conditional. Maybe they'll depend on the nature of the media content that they're exposed to, or the nature of the individual. So those are all sort of logical hypotheses or expectations you could have. So what I want to do in my presentation today is present some studies we've been doing that help answer some of these questions. So first, I'll talk a little bit about the nature of portrayals of African Americans in the media. Then I'll talk about the contributions of media use to their gender beliefs. I'll talk about contributions of media use to stereotypes about Black women, a specific kind of gender message. And finally, we'll talk about the consequences of these beliefs for Black relationships. So my goal is just to give you an overview of some of my research program in the last 20 years. I won't hit every study, and I won't hit every component of every study, but I'll just try to highlight some of the key findings and definitely leave room at the end for questions. Okay, so the first question is, what are the prominent messages about femininity and masculinity in the media that are consumed by Black youth? One of the first studies that we did to analyze this was analysis of music videos, because back, 15 or so years ago, they were really big on TV all the time. It was a big part of young people's diets, and we said, okay, well, what are the messages that are on there about men, about women, about relationships? So we did a content analysis of the 70 most popular BET videos from the year 2000. We coded each video for the presence, it's there, it's not there, of 18 sexual behaviors, because we wanted to see how men and women were shown relating to each other. We also coded the level of dress or undress of each main character or performer to get sense about sort of sexualized bodies and how they're presented. We also coded any occupation that any character or performer was shown doing, just to get a sense again of the roles that women and men are shown doing. So what do we find? We did find sexual imagery in 84% of the music videos, so a good percentage of them did have sexual images. In terms of the kinds of behaviors we saw, these are just some of the 18 behaviors that we coded for. The most prevalent behaviors were women dancing sexually in a very sexual way, 57% of the videos, and even more of the videos by male artists. And we also saw a lot of sexual objectification of women. There's just sort of a focus on one specific body part of a woman without sort of representing her as a whole person. We also saw some of this sexualization in the clothing that they were wearing. So 71% of the female clothing was coded as mildly or very provocative, often lingerie, bathing suits, partial nudity, versus half that percentage for men. So definitely was a very sort of sexualized presentation of women in these music videos. So I wanted to give you a flavor for one of the music videos in our study. Again, I know this is old. This is 2000, but this may be sort of blast from the past for some of you. So look at the imagery, not the music. So again, legs framing the image, like they're like objects, a lot of sort of cuts to women's body parts. Okay, that's just 1 minute. Okay, so that gives you a flavor of one of the videos that we coded and some of the kind of imagery that was common. One of the other things that we coded for were occupations. What are the women and men shown doing in these music videos, which are heavily consumed by young people at the time? For men, they were shown in 21 different jobs. Most notably in law enforcement, things like shown as police officers in the videos, or security guards or bodyguards. So it was a good diverse representation of male jobs. For women, though, they were only shown in 9 occupations total, and the #1 role was stripper. So there was much less diversity for women, very sort of constrained role, again, heavy emphasis on their appearance. So that was one of our first studies, gave us a sense of some of the imagery that young people are exposed to. We've tried to look more recently at some of the roles and something a little bit richer, because videos are just visual images that shoot at you. So we're also more curious about more rich portrayals, more rich characterizations. So we just finished conducting a study of how Black women are portrayed on scripted TV programs. And so for this study, we've looked at 12 programs, drawing from a Nielsen consumer report about programs that are watched in Black households, and also some internet searching of programs with dominant Black female leads, because we wanted to see, dominant Black women on television. So we analyzed shows like Empire, Scandal, Insecure, This Is Us. And we analyzed 4 episodes of sitcoms and 3 episodes of dramas, yielding 33 hours of scripted content. And we had 3 Black women who were trained coders, who we spent quite a bit of time training them on our coding system so they could be reliable with each other when they see the same thing at the same time. And we coded each minute of these programs. So each minute we would see, okay, is the target Black woman present in this minute, yes or no? And if she's present in that minute, is she shown doing any of our list of 33 actions that we were coding for? And so what did we code for, the 33 behaviors? We tried to look at dimensions of femininity. One, we looked at domestic activity. Is she showing doing sort of things that are considered domestic, like making meals, taking care of children? So we had 6 of those actions. We initially had giving orders and commands as part of domestic activity, but then we pulled that out and looked at it on its own because you could be giving orders and commands outside the house, not just to your kids or to your family members. So we looked at giving orders and commands. We also looked at sexualization via 5 items, things like is her stomach exposed, legs exposed. We looked at primping, the importance of appearance for women, where they show applying makeup, looking in the mirror, things like that. We looked at sexuality via 4 items, where they shown kissing or engaged in sexual relations. We did look at work-related issues, so 2 items, are they shown at work or are they shown talking about work somewhere else? And because, being affiliative and supportive is a prominent part of the female role, so we looked at women's friendships via 3 items. Are they shown like laughing with their friends? We looked at emotionality, for being emotional as part of the traditional female role. So they're shown crying or they're shown stomping away from a situation. And then finally, we looked at stress. Because, Black women are confronting both racism and sexism and many other issues in society. So they're shown talking about stress, dealing with the stress of being a Black woman. So we wanted to look and code for that as well. So every minute of these shows, we coded for each of these 33 things. So how are Black women portrayed? First, I'll present some general characteristics, and then I'll present some of the findings. In terms of general characteristics, we saw about 37% were married, but 63% were not married. We did see that most were mothers, about 62%. And in terms of occupations, we often saw mostly professional occupations, like Bo there from Blackish, who's a doctor, or white-collar office occupations. Those seem to be the more prominent ones. Now, what proportion of their minutes on screen were Black women shown engaging in specific actions? Well, what was most prevalent? Most prevalent was giving orders and commands, inside the house, outside the house, whatever, and work-related issues, showing at work, showing talking about work. So we do see Black women in very much of an authoritative role on these TV programs, giving orders, showing at work, working, outside of work. Oh, okay, hold on, my screen is doing something weird. Okay. Then we also did see some more sort of traditional female depictions, Black women as emotional in about 5.6% of their scenes on screen, sexualization in 3.4%, and friendship issues in 3.3%. So some sort of depictions of traditional sort of female roles. Less prevalent was sexuality, domestic activity, which is surprising given how high of them were mothers, little primping, and very little depictions of their stress. They're talking about stress, they're handling the stress that comes with being a Black woman and dealing with racism, sexism, things like that. So that gives a little bit of flavor for how Black women are shown. We see a more sexualized portrayal in music videos, and then in more scripted TV programs, we see more, a little bit sexualized, but often just more of an authoritative kind of role. So that's a little bit about that. So now that we have a sense of the kinds of images and content that is out there, the question then becomes, is exposure to media content related to Black people's endorsement of traditional gender norms and beliefs? So before I present findings, I'll show you some of the theories and mechanisms that we use to guide this part of our research. Now, when people think about media effects, they often think about direct imitation, right? A prime example is that scene, for example, in Crazy Stupid Love, where they try to, oh, you can't even see that. Anyways, they're trying out this scene from Dirty Dancing because they think it'll be erotic to do the leap and things like that. And that's what many people may think about when we think of, media effects. They think of direct imitation. You imitate something you see in the media, right? It's not what I'm talking about, okay? And other people think, well, you ask people, are the media affecting you? And most people will say, no, not me. There's very much the classic third-person effect. Everyone assumes the media are affecting people, those anonymous other people, not me. So when we think about media effects, we're thinking about something that's more subtle, nuanced, cumulative. So we're not talking about direct imitation. I anticipate that effects will be subtle, cumulative, under the radar, right? Exposure to media may help you sort of build a sense of what is normative in your culture, what is expected, what is valued, what is rewarded, and what is punished. So you develop these sense of norms and expectations from your media exposure. And so with that general premise in mind, we draw on three sort of theories as we conduct our research. One is cultivation theory, proposed by George Gerbner and colleagues, and this theory focuses on the role of exposure levels. This theory argues that there's sort of consistent messages that are out there in the media, and that the more you're exposed to them, over time you come to cultivate or adopt beliefs that are matching the kind of content that you see. So that's cultivation. So we look at exposure to see how much people are exposed to content. A second theory that we rely on is social cognitive theory by Bandura. And Bandura focuses very much on cognitions. He argues that it's sort of how you're processing and connecting to the media that will determine the kind of effect it'll have. So how you're connecting, how you're processing. So one of the cognitions that we look at a lot is perceived realism. Do you think it's realistic? Do you think the content is representative, authentic, assuming that the effects will be stronger for those who assume the content is more real, right? So we'll give them questions. Usually we have like a 7 or 8 item scale. Things like TV shows things as they really are in life. Or TV lets me see how other people really live. So we'll do exposure, we'll do some cognitions. And then finally, the third theory we draw on is the differential susceptibility to media effects model by Valkenburg and Peter. And this model reminds us that viewer characteristics matter, that certain people will be more vulnerable or susceptible to media effects. So you have to sort of take those components into account as well. So in our research, we often control for or assess factors like gender, there might be differences there, SES, we look at ethnic identity, we look at religiosity, because these viewer characteristics might affect how much you're affected by the media. Okay, so with that sort of theoretical foundation, I'll share with you findings from a few of our studies. Okay, one of our earlier studies, we looked at how exposure to the gender stereotypes in music videos, now that we sort of coded and analyzed the videos, we kind of got a sense of what's there. So we wanted to see does exposure relate to teens' gender beliefs. So in this study, the participants were 152 African American high school students, a mean age of about 16. And they were from relatively middle-class backgrounds. Their parents had more than high school, not quite college years of schooling on average. And we tested the students in summer enrichment sessions at the university, and we worked with them over 2 sessions. In the first session, they completed surveys about their regular media use. We gave a list of TV shows, and they indicate how often they watch each one. We also had some measures about their gender beliefs, sort of mixed in with a bunch of other scales, so we could see how media use is linked to their gender beliefs. And then the second session, we did a more experimental component where we had them view 4 music videos. And then they completed some measures of attitudes and beliefs about gender after watching these music videos. Okay, so I'll walk you through each one and then the results. So for the survey part, they looked at everyday media use. We asked them about their frequency of watching music videos, average weekday, Saturday, Sunday, frequency of listening to music. And then we asked their endorsement of traditional gender roles through the scale that's abbreviated ATWSA. It's the Attitudes Towards Women's Scale for Adolescents. And they had items like boys are better leaders than girls, agree, disagree. And then we also asked them to rate certain attributes and how important it is for women and men to have certain traits. And then these traits that we gave them actually fell into 2 groups. One which we labeled flash, so how important is it for women and important is it for men to be attractive, to be cool, to be rich, to be in shape or athletic, and they would rate each trait. And then how important is it for them to be nice, intelligent, and funny, and that's our substance group. So we can see if their everyday media use is linked to their gender beliefs or their ratings of the importance of these attributes. Is everyone sort of following along? Okay. So for this first component, we did see many significant correlations. So we saw that the more they consume music videos in an everyday life, the more they endorsed traditional gender roles, and the more importance they thought flash was for women and men. And the more they listened to music, the more important they thought flash was for women and men. So we did see significant correlations between everyday media use and their beliefs. But these are just connections. So in order to show any kind of causality, you really need experiments, where you're showing one group this kind of content and another group this kind of content and then testing their attitudes afterwards. So with the experimental component, we did that. So one group watched sort of 4 really stereotypical music videos where women are shown as sexual objects. It keeps wanting me to do email or something. Okay, women are sexual objects. Men are shown as players, they're shown as emotionally and physically hard. And there's a heavy importance of wealth and physical appearance. So 4 music videos like that. And then other students watched more neutral, non-sexual music videos without those sort of sexual and gender stereotypes in them. And then all the groups completed attitude measures afterwards. Again, we kind of mixed them in with different things so they wouldn't know exactly what we were asking. But we did have 14 items that looked at sort of gender and sexual stereotypes of women and men. Items like, most women are sly and deceptive when they are out to attract a man, often hiding their flaws and playing it sweet. Or, there's nothing wrong with men whistling at shapely women. Just trying to get a sense of where they were, agree, disagree. And then we found that the experimental group in gray was more likely to endorse those kinds of statements than was the members of the control group in brown. So we did see both some survey connections and some experimental connections. And then the other thing that comes into play when you're trying to show, are these things connected, is time. Because we just showed them one image in the lab and tested their attitudes afterwards. What about how these things might work over time? So in a second study, we looked to see if TV viewing predicts greater support for traditional gender beliefs over time. So in this study, we surveyed 148 Black and white 6th graders. And the students completed surveys approximately 4 months apart. So we came to their school and they completed surveys about media use and attitudes, and then we came back 4 months later and did it again to see if their media use at time 1 predicts their attitudes 4 months later. So for media, we just asked how much they watch TV in general. It was a very general measure in this particular survey, how much they watch after school, in the evening, Saturday, Sunday, things like that. And then for traditional gender roles, we had that same scale again, the ATWSA scale, with items like swearing is worse for a girl than for a boy, agree, disagree, or boys are better leaders than girls. So the question is, does exposure levels at time 1 correlate with children's gender beliefs at time 2? And the answer is, yes, they did. For the Black girls and the Black boys in our samples, how much they watch TV predict more traditional gender attitudes 4 months later. And we did not actually see significant results for the white children in our sample, but it was a smaller N for them. So these studies were done with youth and show some contributions of media to some of their gender beliefs. But we thought, well, perhaps adults will be less vulnerable or susceptible, because they're older. So we wondered how these processes might work with African American adults. And also, the studies that I presented to you had very general measures of TV viewing. So we wondered, would more nuanced measures be more informative? And one of the genres that was really popular at the time we did the study a few years ago was reality TV. Very popular genre. So we wondered, okay, so might reality TV exposure predict greater acceptance of traditional femininity among Black adults? And then the last problem or limitation of the earlier research I presented was that it just looked at exposure. It didn't look at some of those cognitions in those studies. So we really wanted to add how much they're exposed to the shows and also how real or realistic they think they are. So for this study, we looked at how much they watch a group of sort of mainstream reality TV shows like The Bachelor and Survivor. We also looked at how much they watched a group of Black-oriented reality shows, things like Love and Hip Hop, Black Ink Crew, and then we had an 8-item measure of how real they think reality TV is. And then we were able to see if those factors are linked to their support for 5 components of traditional femininity. And we tested these relations among 486 Black adults, 18 to 40, so the young adults, mostly 20s and 30s. So how did we measure this sort of traditional femininity belief? The main component was the femininity ideology scale, which looks at buying into traditional feminine norms. And so it had a subscale that looked at your support for stereotypic images and activities for women, things like women should have soft voices. Another scale looked at the component of deference and dependence, which is part of traditional femininity. And they had items like a woman should not be competitive. Agree, disagree. A caretaking scale with items like a woman should know how people are feeling, right? That nurturant part of women, empathy. An emotional subscale with items like it is expected that a woman will be viewed as overly emotional. And then finally, we wanted to get at the courtship component, how women and men are shown interacting with each other. And so we used the heterosexual script scale, which had 22 items like, it is up to women to keep things from moving too fast sexually. So it looks at the different roles in courtship for women and men, women as the, sort of the gatekeepers, the attractive ones, but not too sexually active, and men as the more assertive and aggressive ones. So we had all these different scales, and then we could look to see if their regular media use is linked to these beliefs. So first I'll share some baseline correlations, and then I'll share some regression equations. So baseline, are these things correlated with each other? Answer is yes. So the more they watch mainstream reality TV, the more they watch Black-oriented reality TV, the more realistic they think it is, the greater support they offered for all of those components of traditional femininity. So significant correlations, positive across the board. And it did it again, okay. Okay, so that's just the variables baseline. We want to know how things are going to work when we add in demographics and when we add in all the factors together. So which reality TV variables best predict these beliefs when we take these things into account? So when we look at viewer characteristics like gender, we control for their relationship status, are they partnered or not, their schooling, their racial identity, how much TV they normally watch. So we control for all those things. And then we add in our reality TV variables, Black reality TV, mainstream, and realism. And each column will be a regression equation, so we'll see the numbers in each column. Is there a pointer? Okay. Anyway, so this gives you a feel for the equations. We did see that many of the demographic, well, being male played a role in the findings. A little bit schooling, the stars represent the significant results. But we didn't find as strong an effect for TV by itself. We saw that Black reality TV viewing, the more they watched the Black reality TV views, it was linked to greater support of the heterosexual script at the end. And the more they watched the mainstream reality TV shows, the more they supported notions that women are supposed to be deferent and dependent. But the main predictor in these equations was realism. So thinking that reality TV is real, the more real they think the reality TV is, the stronger support they offered for each of those dimensions of traditional femininity. But what we're also realizing is that traditional femininity was only one component of femininity that we're exposed to in our culture. So we wondered, could media exposure contribute to Black viewers' acceptance of specific stereotypes and beliefs about Black women? So we know that Black girls and women confront both mainstream notions of what women are supposed to be like and also specific racial stereotypes about women. So they confront mainstream notions of women, they're supposed to be emotional, right? Crying and eating ice cream. Women are sort of domestic with the housewives. Women are sexual objects. Those are some of the mainstream notions. But they also confront stereotypes about Black women in our culture. And there's three prominent stereotypes that are often talked about by various scholars. You know, we hear about the controlling images. We see books about these kind of stereotypes. One of the prominent stereotypes is the Jezebel stereotype of Black women as sort of hypersexual and manipulative, which came about, during slavery times, sort of justification for the mass sexual assault of enslaved Black women, that they're sort of hypersexual and manipulative, and they sort of make these things happen. So that's sort of one common stereotype that persists today. A second common stereotype about Black women came about with the Amos and Andy era, the Sapphire, the sort of angry, loud, emasculating Black woman, and it's talked about as a Sapphire today, or maybe the angry Black woman, those sort of stereotypes about Black women. And the third one is seen more of like a cultural ideal than a stereotype, sort of the notion of the strong Black woman, right? And the strong Black woman is expected to prioritize others' needs over her own. She's supposed to resist asking for help. She's supposed to be able to overcome harsh circumstances regardless of these challenges, which is sort of a positive stereotype in some way, but it's linked to sort of diminished mental health, and it sort of diminishes Black women's humanity in other ways. So those are some of the images that we see in the larger culture about Black women. So we're wondering, well, could media use be linked to some of these notions about Black women? So in this first study, we looked at adolescents, and we asked, does adolescents' TV use predict their beliefs about the strong Black women, which we abbreviate as SPW. So in this study, we surveyed 121 Black high school students, mean age of about 15 and a half. And we looked at their TV use, how much they watch TV in general over the course of the week, weekday, Saturday, Sunday. We also assessed their frequency of viewing 9 programs with white cast to look a little bit about their viewing of popular mainstream sort of programming. Their viewing of programming, 12 programs with predominantly Black casts. And for their gender beliefs, we used the Strong Black Woman Scale developed by Kia Thomas, which has items like Black women stay strong even when things get tough. So we're wondering if any of the TV variables might predict endorsement of this notion of Black women. It had never really been tested before with teens, so we didn't know if they were gonna buy into the notion or believe it or anything like that. But we did find that the more they watched the Black-oriented TV, the more they did buy into the sort of the strong Black woman ideal or schema. So we do see connections between media and this belief for teens. So we're wondering, okay, so we see that with teens. Again, what about adults? And what about all the other stereotypes as well, right? So we wonder, does TV exposure predict adults' agreement with the various notions about Black women? So here we used a broader sample of media. So we looked at how much they watched music videos, like the kind that I showed you. We gave a list of 15 sort of reality shows, things like Keeping Up with the Kardashians, Basketball Wives, Love and Hip Hop. We had a list of 23 popular dramas, things like Game of Thrones, Empire, Blacklist. For fantasy dramas, things like Arrow, Flash, Gotham. And finally, the TV realism, 7 or 8 questions about how real they think TV is. And then we looked to see if this is connected at all to their beliefs about Black women as Jezebels, Sapphires, or strong Black women. And we tested this with a national sample of 431 Black adults. This is the full age span, so here the mean was closer to 30 because it included people from 18 to 74. So let me tell you a little bit about the measures, and then I'll share the results. So the stereotypes about Black women, we used the stereotypical roles for Black women scale developed by Anita Thomas, and we actually added some more items to enrich the scale because she didn't have a lot per each subscale. So for the Jezebel, there ended up being 11 items that measured that sort of stereotype. Things like Black women are more seductive than other women, and Black women use sex to get what they want. The Sapphire subscale had items like Black women are always mad and ready to fight. Black women have a problematic attitude. And then we used the Strong Black Women Scale, which we had used before from Kia Thomas. It's funny, one's Anita Thomas and one's Kia Thomas. Items like Black women are reluctant to ask for help. So again, we see if their regular everyday media use is linked to stronger support for these beliefs about Black women. Baseline correlations, are these things associated, did show nearly significant associations in each instance. So the more they consume these various forms of media, the more they endorse nearly all these beliefs about Black women, except for that one that's not starred and dark at the end. So we did see baseline associations with adults. So then again, we wanted to run regression equations to put everything in there together to see what's going to emerge as the biggest predictor. We control for demographics, their gender, whether they're married or not, their religiosity, their ethnic identity, all these things to see what would emerge as the biggest predictor. So let's walk you through the results. Which TV variables best predict acceptance of the Sapphire stereotype, that sort of angry Black woman stereotype? And here it was dramas, so the more they consumed the mainstream dramas, the more they supported that stereotype, and the more realistic they think TV is, the more they supported that stereotype. And again, controlling for all these other things. Which TV variables best predict acceptance of the Jezebel stereotype? And here we see music videos. The more they consume music videos, the more they endorse Jezebel, mainstream dramas, and thinking TV is real. Those are all linked to more support. I'm sorry, I meant to say, as the bar goes up, it means more support, and the higher the bar, the more support, and the bar goes down, it means less support. So watching those fantasy dramas was linked to less support of the Jezebel stereotype. And then finally, which TV variables predict acceptance of the SPW ideal? Here it was the dramas. The more they watch those dramas, the more they support SPW. The more real they think TV is, the more they support SPW. But watching the fantasies again was linked to less. And then the final component of my research has been to look at the consequences. I've shown that media is linked to having these beliefs. So you have these beliefs, what role does it play in your lives really? So we've been looking to see what are the consequences of endorsing these traditional gender beliefs and these traditional stereotypes about Black women, especially for relationships between Black women and men. Okay. So in one study, we've examined how men's beliefs about women in these ways may affect some of their relationships with women. And here we looked at the role of violence, dating violence, sexual aggression against women, right? Because we know that dehumanizing someone is often one of the first steps in accepting aggression towards them, right? So we wondered if viewing women as sexual objects, not really a person, they're these one-dimensional stereotypes and not really people, might lead to greater acceptance of aggression towards them. So in this study, we analyzed how men's everyday media use links to their viewing women as sexual objects, they're buying into the Jezebel and Sapphire stereotypes about women, and in turn, might those beliefs be linked to greater acceptance of sexual aggression? And we tested these notions among 182 Black men, 18 to 40, single, married. It was a national sample, but half was from the South, which is interesting. Okay, how do we measure these things? Media use, we looked at their frequency of viewing 52 popular TV programs, things like Empire, Walking Dead, it's hard to see the picture, Walking Dead and The Flash. We also looked at how often they consume music videos, average weekday, Saturday, Sunday, and how often they go to the movies, stream movies, things like that. So we looked at those main viewing media consumptions. And then we measured their attitudes among multiple dimensions. We had a scale that looked at the notion that women are sexual objects. So they indicate their agreement with statements like, before a woman goes out in public, she should make sure she looks her best. Or there's nothing wrong with men whistling at shapely women. We use the stereotypic roles for Black women scale to get the Jezebel and the Sapphire component, and I won't go through that again. And finally, for outcomes, we looked at men's acceptance of dating violence. It's a 12-item scale, things like some girls deserve to be slapped by their boyfriends. Agree, disagree? And we also looked at men's acceptance of rape myths with using the Burt scale, items like a woman who is stuck up and thinks she is too good to talk to guys on the street deserves to be taught a lesson. Agree, disagree? So I'll break down the two components we did. Does media use predict these beliefs? And do these beliefs lead to greater acceptance of dating aggression? So does everyday media use predict men's beliefs about women? And we did find for the women are sexual objects notion that the more they watch our list of popular TV programs, the more likely they would say, oh yeah, women are objects and their appearance matters, and that's how they should be valued. And for the stereotypes about Black women, the Jezebel and Sapphire, it was the movies here, which is interesting. The more they watch popular mainstream movies, the more likely they were to think these things about Black women. And then we checked to see, well, do these beliefs about women affect men's interpersonal violence attitudes? And we found that they did. So the more that men thought that women are sexual objects and bought into those Black women stereotypes, the more accepting they were about rape myths. And the more they thought those things about women, the more accepting they were of dating violence towards women. So that's a little bit about how men's beliefs might affect their relationships with men and women. What about women? So we wondered, does media use predict greater acceptance of traditional gender roles and traditional sexual scripts, which in turn might affect Black women's sexual agency. So if we think of the traditional gender roles for women, right, they're supposed to be the passive ones. You're supposed to just look pretty, but not be that active. You're supposed to wait for men to make the first move. So we wondered, if you're buying into those scripts, does that affect your own sense of agency, your enjoyment and empowerment of your own sexuality? We wondered, could that make it more diminished? So with this study, we looked at how 4 kinds of media use: movies, reality TV hours, music video hours, and here we had 9 women's magazines in this study. So their consumption of these things, does that lead to buy into more traditional gender and sexual script beliefs? And we had 3 measures here, which I'm not gonna go through, but the heterosexual script we've talked about, and those are just more traditional gender belief scales. And does that in turn lead to women's sexual agency? And we tested this model among 609 undergraduate and graduate Black women, a mean age of about 22, and half were from a PWI and half were from an HBCU. So we haven't talked about sexual agency much in this panel, so I'll just share with you what those measures are like before I share the results. So how do we measure sexual agency? Just feeling empowered about your sexuality. So we had 4 measures. One was sexual assertiveness, which had 25 items, things like, I communicate my sexual desires to my partner. And then we wanted to look at the sort of the flip side of agency, which was like inhibition, not feeling comfortable with your own sexuality. So we measured this in a few ways. One was the sexual guilt and shame scale, which had items like sexual activity makes me feel ashamed. We also had a sexual self-consciousness subscale with items like, I quickly feel embarrassed in sexual situations. And finally, we wanted to look at the sort of the neediness and desperate component, which is part of the female relational imperative that women are always supposed to have a relationship and always supposed to have a man and always be with somebody. So to measure that, we used a subscale that was part of the sexual deception measure, but still fit our needs. And then we asked women things like, have you ever had sex with someone so that you would have someone to sleep next to? Or have you ever had sex with someone so they wouldn't break up with you? Kind of a sense of that relational imperativeness for women. So this ended up being the model that we tested. So we had our 4 dimensions of media use linked to women's buying into traditional gender and sexual scripts, and does that in turn affect these 3 components of sexual agency? And we tested this larger model with structural equation modeling. And we had controlled for the school, HBCU, PWI, we controlled for their age, and we controlled for their level of sexual experience. So what did we find? We found a model that fit the data very well, and we found significant pathways in all fronts. So we found that the more women consume this mainstream media, the more they endorse these traditional gender and sexual scripts about women. And the more they endorse those scripts, the less sexually assertive they were in their own relationships, the more sexually inhibited they were, embarrassed, ashamed of their sexuality, and the more they had demonstrated these sort of needy behaviors. So let me summarize all the many findings I've shared with you today. We see in our studies that Black women are often portrayed in an authoritative role or in a sexualized role in the media, but does tend to vary by genre, right? Different for music videos than for some dramas. We saw across many studies that media use emerged as a significant correlate of African Americans' gender beliefs and was linked to more traditional beliefs about gender roles, was linked to endorsing stereotypes of Black women as Jezebels and Sapphires, and was linked to support for the strong Black woman ideal. We saw that with some surveys, we saw it longitudinal data, we saw some experiments, we saw it in a few different ways. And we also saw contributions of multiple media genres. TV programs, different kind of TV programs mattered. We saw a strong role of perceived realism, especially for adults. But we also saw that endorsing these beliefs predicts greater acceptance of sexual aggression among men and diminished sexual agency among women. And so the last thing I want to leave you with today is just some reflections about where to go from here. Studying media and media effects is a moving target, So see, that's my moving target. Yeah, see, moving target. Okay, because I've been doing this for 20 years. And when I started studying media, there were like 4 channels, and there was no streaming, there was no reality TV, there was no social media. I mean, it was simple and easy, but now it's expanded, it's changed, it's growing, so many different new things. So I try to grow and move with it. So lots of things I'd like to continue to do in the future as we explore these questions. So future directions, I want to try to look at some of the diverse media, look a little bit more at social media. We're starting to look at that now. Look more at movies. I know movies play a big role in young people's lives. We haven't really even tapped into that. I want to look more at mechanisms. You know, we looked at perceived realism some, and that seems to play a role. I also want to look at things like identification. You know, if you identify with a certain character or not, will that have more or less of an impact on you? I want to look at masculinity. Oh, where am I? Sorry. Yeah, masculinity and portrayals of Black men. We've done a lot with women and Black women, and so we're starting to do some analyses of portrayals of Black men and how Black men are affected by these images. I want to look at younger youth. We've done mostly teens on up. So what about the younger kids and how it affects them and their gender beliefs and their sense of who they can be and who they can become? And on that same vein, I want to look at, oh, that's kind of dark. I want to look at academic consequences. You know, does these gender beliefs affect the things kids aspire to, their performance in the classroom, their sense of what boys and girls are supposed to be doing? So we're starting to look at academic consequences in our current work as well. So I ask you to stay tuned, and thank you.